So recently, the popular Christian YouTuber Inspiring Philosophy reviewed the debate I did with Alex O'Connor versus the preachers Cliff and Stuart Knechtle. And here I'm going to point out what I think are 10 mistakes they made in replying to my case against the biblical God. There are, I think, some real blunders, especially the last one, which is particularly important. But I do want to say that unlike the kind of ridiculous reaction that Capturing Christianity's Cameron Bertuzzi made, Mike Jones, who runs the channel, and his guest Stan, did actually acknowledge how badly this went for the Connectleys.
It did not make the Christian side look good, and I think in terms of rhetoric, the atheists clearly won this conversation.
So before I point out their errors, I think it's worth giving them some props for that. But let's look at the first mistake. We'll see my claim, their reply, and then I'll offer my rebuttal.
In Deuteronomy, God orders those of a town who advocate worshipping a different God to be put to the sword, but not just the people, but also their animals. The same for the Amalekites. God orders their destruction, including their animals. God drowned almost all the animals in the world, including puppies and kittens, because of human sin.
All right, so right then there's a lot there to sort of unpack. I don't think this is a straw man because he says he's responding to Cliff's arguments or beliefs. Great. But I mean, like, we can easily say not all Christians believe in a global flood.
Yeah.
Right then and there. Not all Christians believe that these Old Testament passages, like he mentioned, like he alluded to 1 Samuel 15 is literal. I've argued it's hagiographic hyperbole.
In the paper I wrote and cited during the debate, my colleagues and I specifically address this claim. You don't have to be a literalist. What you have to be is someone who thinks that God's actions as depicted in the story, like killing the animals in the 10 plagues, is good. It's independent of whether they happened or not. Think of an analogy. We could assume that George Lucas, author of Star Wars, thinks the Empire is evil. You can tell it from the tone of the movie. You don't have to think that the events depicted in the movie are true to extract the moral viewpoint of the author. Similarly, the biblical authors clearly think it's okay to kill all the firstborn Egyptian domestic animals in the 10th plague because God does it and he's considered good. And that's the problem. It doesn't matter if you think these events happened or not. Although Mike Jones made a whole documentary claiming the Exodus did happen. So this criticism is kind of ironic.
I think one of my biggest problems with Phil's argument is that it implicitly is assuming utilitarianism.
This mistake is a whopper. There are lots of different moral systems that could justify our argument against God from animal suffering. So for those that don't know, utilitarianism is the view that morality can be determined by sort of adding up the utility and disutility of sentient beings. In other words, their sort of satisfaction or dissatisfaction, their pains and pleasures, and saying what's moral is maximizing this utility. It's supposed to be an objective form of morality. Now, the argument can be run on utilitarianism, but obviously the argument doesn't depend on this. Alex O'Connor, my friend and debate partner here, makes the same argument. He isn't a utilitarian, and he said so in the debate.
When it comes to ethical decision, for example, it's well known that amongst my followers that I'm an ethical emotivist.
An emotivist is someone very, very different. The scheme is unashamedly subjective. It says moral statements are statements of emotions. So as long as you, at an emotional level, disapprove of cruelty to animals, then you can make this argument. And I think most people do have that emotional response, so it should work with most people. The argument just assumes that unnecessary suffering of animals is bad. Now, there are lots of other ethical schemes this argument can be run on, from deontology to virtue ethics to constructivism, but instead of going into those, why don't we simply use one that maybe Jesus would approve of? And that's Judaism. Now, Judaism isn't an ethical scheme, granted, but it has ethical beliefs. And one of them is inherent in the way that kosher food is prepared. When animals are killed in Judaism, they have to be killed by a shochet. Now, let's take a look at what the organization of Shecheta actually say is the reason for their method of slaughter. It is a cardinal tenet of the Jewish faith that the laws of Shecheta were divinely given to Moses at Mount Sinai. The rules governing Shecheta are codified and defined and are binding and valued today as ever, and they ensure a swift and painless dispatch of the animal. Infringing the laws of shecheta renders the meat unconditionally forbidden as food to Jews. The time-hallowed practice of shecheta, marked as it is by compassion and consideration for the welfare of the animal, has been a central pillar in the sustaining of Jewish life for millennia. Now, people argue about whether or not kosher methods are the most humane, and that's not the point here. The point is the unnecessary suffering of animals is clearly implied to be a bad thing in Judaism, and Judaism is not utilitarianism. And this is where the problems lie, because if unnecessary suffering of animals is a bad thing, then God shouldn't command it or do it, but he does. That's what happens in the 10 plagues, in the laws of Deuteronomy, in the story of Legion and the 2,000 pigs, and so on. That's why I claim this is an internal critique, because Jews, and I think many, although perhaps not all, contemporary Christians, think that unnecessary suffering of animals is bad. I mean, consider the Catholic Catechism, CCC 2418 says, quote, "is contrary to human dignity to cause animals to suffer or die needlessly," close quote. So if God commands or allows needless animal suffering, then we have an internal tension. Now, some Christians could just, bite the bullet, follow the likes of Augustine or Descartes, and say animal suffering needlessly is fine. Well, let's hear them say so.
It seems as though this is almost appealing to emotion.
The argument no more appeals to emotion than the moral argument for God does. And by the way, Mike also makes material defending the moral argument. The moral argument for God implies there are moral facts, like murder is wrong. And if the theist can appeal to those notions without appeals to emotion, then so can the atheist. Except, one can make the statement conditional and say if there are moral facts, then this should be wrong. As Alex said in the debate.
Making a criticism similar to what Lincoln said of slavery. If this is not wrong, then nothing is wrong. I'm not saying that it's wrong. I'm not saying that it's immoral. I haven't used moralized terms. What I'm saying is that it's unexpected on the command of a loving God.
Because I don't necessarily think it's wrong to kill animals. I think that is an unjustified assumption in Phil's argument that he's just sort of thrown in there without actually justifying it.
One could argue the needless killing of animals is wrong, or even simpler, we could just say the needless suffering is wrong, even if it's okay to kill. Think back to the rules of kosher food killing. What they argue is that if an animal must be killed, then it should be done painlessly. So our argument assumes that unnecessary suffering of animals is wrong. Consider Joshua 11:6, where God commands the Hebrew armies to hough the horses of the enemy. This means to sever the Achilles tendon of the horse so as to disable it in battle. Now, given God is omnipotent, he could have taken the horses out of the battle without this torture. He could have teleported them somewhere else, or he could have given them tranquilizers. But he didn't. So that is equivalent to killing an animal in a painful way when they could have done it in a painless way, which is what Jewish practice expressly forbids in the context of kosher law. So using these very same principles, we can make this argument. And it actually does not depend on the assumption that it's wrong to kill animals, only that unnecessary suffering is wrong. And again, as Alex O'Connor said in the debate, we don't need to even use the language of right and wrong, only that it's inconsistent with what we would expect God to do given the claims being made about him.
Haven't read Trent Doherty's book, The Problem of Animal Pain, a theodicy for all creatures, great and small. It's a must read if you're going to talk about the problem of evil in general.
So they're quoting Trent Doherty, and it seems like they're kind of clutching at straws, grasping at any defense that might try and deflect the problem. But yet again, notice, first Mike said,
because I don't necessarily think it's wrong to kill animals. He still is not justified that animal suffering is necessarily evil.
And I think the reason for this is that he's trying to imply there isn't really a problem to be solved. Otherwise, why make this comment? Well, the relevance here is because Doherty is actually really clear. This is what he says about animal suffering. Open quote, "Prima facie at least, is not at all what we would expect from an all-powerful, all-loving God. Yet it seems, prima facie at least, to be just what we'd expect, or at least not too surprising, given naturalism. Thus, until other data and explanatory virtues, especially simplicity, are taken into account, it looks like naturalism is a much better explanation of the data of animal suffering than is theism. This is surely a problem for theists, close quote. So it seems they're contradicting their own source. Now, of course, Doherty does think he can come up with a solution, but he does recognize there's a serious problem. But Mike's quote about, oh, it's not really wrong to kill animals, seems to reject that.
The main point here is what we're actually going to expect to see, and what the shape of reality is going to look like given God's existence is going to be based on or contextualized on what things are valuable and what's true about value. And so, yeah, you're right, Mike. It seems to kind of almost assume this pain and pleasure value system, but predominantly I would argue that some sort of other value theory is going to be true, especially if Christianity is true, where things like moral exemplarism is going to be a super valuable thing.
The main problem with Phil's argument is that he's assuming a value theory is like if utilitarianism is what Christianity teaches. And I know very little Christians that have held to that.
Doherty does focus on the importance of virtues, and he says the greatest virtue is love. But to Doherty's credit, he doesn't simply claim that this virtue is enough to defeat the problem. He has a whole elaborate scheme of animal resurrection, their transformation into rational beings, who then endorse their suffering. And to me, the biggest implausibility of this scheme is not even the resurrection and transformation bit, but it's the fact that animals, learning of the cruelty the biblical God imparted on them, will suddenly endorse those actions. That, I think, we're given no reason to believe. But note that none of this is even mentioned by Mike and Than, and simply claiming a different set of virtues isn't going to cut it. So right now we're facing a mass extinction event primarily caused by human meat consumption, and God would know this was going to happen and could easily tweak our diets to avoid it. But he didn't. Why not? This is the last issue we raise for our expanded problem of animal suffering. So Mike's reply is
there a way to actually, within the laws of nature, to create big brains humans through an evolutionary process where you get us to where we are without getting sustenance from meat?
Yeah,
it might be, but I think that you'd have to have some sort of supernatural intervention.
So yes, of course we're talking about supernatural intervention. And why couldn't God do that? Let's hear what Van has to say.
I think this is a full explanation for animal suffering or the problem of evil or anything. It's just a puzzle piece, right? And it's called the nomic regularity theodicy. And the basic idea is like what you said. You're just going to have fundamental laws that the universe abides by. And the only reasons why God would intervene are going to be places where he suspends those things or interacts with the world in such a way that it wouldn't occur. In other words, miracles, right? Had he not intervened. And the whole entire point is, well, God would want to create a universe where there's nomic regularity, because if there's not nomic regularity, we can't learn things about the way reality abides. I wouldn't be able to really access too many moral truths, because if there's no more nomic regularity, if I punched Mike in the face one time, he'd really like it.
So he's appealing to God's desire for a law-like regularities in the world. These, Than argues, are required for moral choice to be possible. But we could still have moral choice if we couldn't metabolize meat. There's lots of things we can't metabolize. There's a species of bacteria that can metabolize nylon. We can't. Does that rob us of our moral choice? Of course not. And God gave out commandments for not eating pigs, so he's clearly fine with intervening in human diets. God also does miracles, so I guess this nomic regularity isn't so important. And in fact, it's the very miracles that God does that we're complaining about. God sent the flood, the 10 plagues. Jesus drowns 2,000 pigs. These are supernatural interventions. If God can do miracles to harm animals, why can't he do miracles to help them?
Theists sometimes reply to this by running the moral argument. But this depends on trusting our moral intuitions. And if we can do that, then we should reject the cruel biblical God. And if we can't, then the moral argument fails. Either way, God fails. Now, the cosmology.
So my response to this would almost be like, well, what moral intuitions? Most of our moral intuitions come from Christianity today.
So here we're talking about the moral intuition not to needlessly harm animals. And that came from Christianity? It's hard to take this one seriously. As I pointed out in the debate, the Jain religion is hundreds of years older than Christianity, and its highest spiritual duty is anhisma, which is a sacred vow not to harm other living beings, including animals.
I think I heard this. If I misheard this, just correct me. I think he said something like, well, if atheism is true, none of this is too surprising. And that's one of the things that I brought up in my stream with Cameron, which is, well, that's not really true. Atheism says nothing about reality other than God does not exist. Atheism doesn't predict any of this.
So here the claim is that atheism doesn't predict the data. But what we were debating here is whether the biblical God exists, and I specifically frame the argument that way.
Now, these issues are easily resolved if the biblical God is false. Then it's no surprise that both the Bible and nature are so cruel to animals.
We don't really need to predict the data. Think of it this way. There's lots of cruelty to animals in the Bible. Is that more consistent with it being made up by men of a more brutal culture, or more consistent with it describing the actions of a perfectly loving God? I think it's obviously the former, and that's what the argument is saying. Skeptics don't need to predict that the Bible will describe a God commanding the torture of animals like we see in Joshua 11:6, but they can explain it a lot easier than Christians can.
Of the Bible is another clue to God's fictitious nature. It describes the sky as having a solid dome called the firmament, and we have good reasons to think the authors believe this. The Hebrew word rakayuz implies it, surrounding cultures believed it, and the Bible describes it as holding up the waters above and being firm as a mirror of cast metal. Talmudic rabbis debated how thick it was.
I mean, this is such a hit and miss. It's like, dude, Spivak theory solves all this. I mean, like, when we say the sun is rising, do we actually mean the sun is moving? No. Like when I say I got a gut feeling, do I actually think feelings are in my gut? No. God can use the language of the ancient Near East to give theological truths.
Here, Mike is appealing to language being able to convey meaning in a non-literal way. So take his example of the phrase, the sun is setting. Now, if someone says that, we know they don't mean the sun is literally moving, but only apparently moving. That's right. But we only know this because of the cultural context of the person saying it. They are unlikely to believe in a geocentric solar system with the Earth at its centre. Instead, we take it for granted that they believe in a heliocentric model with the sun at the centre. In that context, we know that a person isn't to be taken literally. But if the person was a geocentrist, then we would have good reason to think they are meaning this phrase literally. Now, I pointed out that the solid dome of the sky mentioned in Genesis was widely believed in the surrounding cultures. It was described in the Bible as being made of solid metal. It was believed to be solid by leading rabbis for centuries and leading church figures from Augustine to Martin Luther. It has an etymology that implies it's solid and is described as holding up the waters above, which it can only do if it's solid. That gives us a lot of context that it should be taken literally. So the justification Mike uses in his sunset case just doesn't apply here. We have every reason to think that the biblical authors really did believe the sky was solid. And again, the best explanation for this is that the text is from ancient men, not inspired by an all-knowing God. And it doesn't commit you to thinking all of Genesis is literal, but that passage I think clearly is. Also, copying surrounding cultures seems a far more reasonable explanation than presuming some mysterious spiritual truth that can only be described by saying the sky is a solid dome.
Genesis were right maybe Christian distrust of science wouldn't be so high today. And this has consequences. Atheist acceptance of climate science is double that of Christians and triple that of evangelical Christians. This could be Christianity's most horrific legacy, turning many people away from science and thus contributing to a climate catastrophe. God could have easily avoided this by guiding the text to have less errors, but he didn't. Yet again, a fact well explained if he doesn't exist.
Now, I'm going to stop there. I'm going to put some slides up here because that was just incredibly inaccurate in so many ways. So research done in the United States and a cross-cultural investigation has found that religiosity, specifically Christianity, is associated with more pro-friendly environmental behaviors. In fact,
This mistake is really bad, and it shows Mike clutching at straws yet again. There's a big difference between environmental concern and acceptance of climate science. You can be concerned about the quality of your water, about the quality of your air, about whether there are dangerous chemicals in your food and so on, without believing in climate change. Consider Trump, who said,
We have some incredibly talented people that know environment and what we're doing probably better than any people on earth. From day one, my administration has made it a top priority to ensure that America is among the very cleanest air and cleanest water on the planet. We want the cleanest air. We want crystal clean water. And that's what we're doing. And that's what we're working on so hard.
Yet we all know Trump is very clear he doesn't believe in climate change.
So Obama's talking about all of this with the global warming and that, and a lot of it's a hoax. It's a hoax. I mean, it's a money-making industry, okay? It's a hoax.
And so one can care about some environmental issues, or even a lot, without believing in climate change. Mike has just confused the two. Indeed, the two studies that Mike shows are about environmental concern. One study doesn't even look at Christianity, but instead religion around the world. Don't forget, the target of my attack was Christianity. The example the paper gives about faith and environmental concerns coming together, in this particular case it was Christianity, was when religious leaders persuaded local fishermen not to dynamite fish. What's that got to do with climate change? Nothing. The other paper was about spending on environmentally friendly products, and it didn't even actually involve studying people's real spending, but rather self-reported expenditure. So I'm a bit skeptical about these findings. But again, even if they're absolutely valid, it's got nothing to do with climate change. Whereas the poll I showed was a direct question about belief in climate change. And what we see is a staggering difference. Atheist acceptance of climate science is around 90%, double that of Christians as a whole, and about 3 times that of evangelicals. This is enormously important because it may change the fate of the world. Evangelicals vote for Trump, they don't believe in climate change, and they don't believe in evolution. They distrust scientists and elect people like Trump, who rather than tries to fight climate change says,
I will also declare a national energy emergency. We will drill, baby, drill.
It seems reasonable to suppose that at least one reason evangelicals distrust scientists is their holy book contradicts what science says. This is why I say this could be one of the most horrific legacies of Christianity. If you want to know the harm of these religious ideas, look no further. If God had guided the text to be more scientifically accurate, then this whole nightmare scenario could have been avoided. So why didn't he? The simplest explanation is that he's a made-up figure of an ancient culture.